It was 4:13 a.m. on Guam, too quiet to feel safe, when the night itself cracked open and something ancient and fast began clawing its way into the sky. On a remote stretch of North Korean coastline, hidden beneath camouflage nets and concrete deception, steel doors slid apart. Not one, not two, multiple launch platforms came alive at once. Engines ignited, the ground trembled, and in less than 6 seconds, ballistic missiles were climbing, vertical, violent, unstoppable, ripping free from gravity like they had been waiting years for permission to breathe. This was not a test. This was not theater. This was aimed. Guam, a small island on the map, a massive symbol in reality, American soil, strategic spine of the Pacific, home to airfields, submarines, bombers, families sleeping with windows open to the ocean air, 13,000 kilometers from Washington, but zero distance from consequence. At 4:13 and 4 seconds, U.S. early warning satellites saw the ignition plumes bloom like white scars on infrared screens. No debate, no interpretation, the algorithm didn't hesitate. Launch detected, trajectory climbing, vector stable, probability hostile, absolute. 4 seconds. That's all it took. By the time the missiles cleared their boost phase, the alert had already jumped continents. Data raced through fiber, satellite, and hardened military networks faster than sound. Pacific Command, NORAD, Strategic Command, Homeland Defense protocols triggered not because of what was coming, but because of where it was headed. American soil. At 4:14 a.m., phones across Guam vibrated in unison. Not a drill, not an exercise. Emergency alert. Ballistic missile threat inbound. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a test. Lights snapped on in houses along the coast. Parents froze in doorways. Soldiers rolled out of bunks already pulling on boots. Tourists stared at glowing screens, trying to process words that didn't belong in a vacation brochure. Somewhere inland, a child asked a question no one had rehearsed an answer for. How much time do we have? 7 minutes. 7 minutes between normal life and rupture. In Pyongyang, the calculation felt clean. 7 minutes for history to decide whether this was a warning or a mistake. Cold. Logical. Strike Guam, not the mainland. Provoke uncertainty, not annihilation. The belief was simple. America hesitates when escalation threatens the whole board. That Washington would pause, convene, debate, measure response against markets, allies, headlines. Delay equals survival. That was the assumption. What North Korea believed was that speed favored the attacker. What they misunderstood was that speed favors preparation, because Guam was not asleep. THAAD batteries were already awake, radar arrays already spinning, Aegis destroyers already tracing invisible domes across the Pacific. The island wasn't just territory, it was a sensor, a trigger, a fuse wired directly into doctrine written decades earlier and updated in silence. This was the moment those doctrines were built for. At 4:15 a.m., the missiles crossed a threshold in altitude where guesses die and math takes over. Their arcs confirmed, their targets narrowing. No ambiguity left. This wasn't coercion, it wasn't signaling, it was a direct challenge to dominance. And dominance doesn't negotiate with timers. Inside hardened command centers, no one raised their voice. Calm took over. Not because the threat was small, but because it was expected. Every screen told the same story from a different angle. Velocity, burn rate, separation events, decoys possibly deploying, or not. What would you do with 10 seconds left? The answer had already been written. North Korea had launched believing fear would slow response, that hesitation would fracture resolve, that force alone could bend strategy. But strategy doesn't flinch. Strategy waits, and then it moves all at once. Because while civilians on Guam counted minutes, something else was already unfolding beyond the horizon. Quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Assets repositioning, orders unlocking, systems transitioning from monitor to execute. The attack phase wasn't just about missiles in the air. It was about a line crossed, a paradigm shift. North Korea had fired at Guam thinking it was pressing pressure. In reality, it had pressed a switch. And as the missiles continued their climb, unaware of what had already been authorized in response, the Pacific went still, not in fear, but in focus. Because the next sound the world would hear would not be an alarm. It was 4:16 a.m. when the ocean around Guam stopped being scenery and became a shield. When silence gave way to a kind of motion so fast it didn't make noise, it made decisions. The first interceptor left its launcher without ceremony. No countdown, no drama, just ignition and acceleration, a clean white streak punching upward as if pulled by gravity in reverse. In that moment, defense became instinct. Machines doing what they were designed to do long before this morning ever arrived. THAAD batteries across the island rotated as one, radar faces tilting toward the sky, locking onto signatures moving faster than fear. The system didn't see missiles, it saw math, speed, heat, probability. An algorithm calculating survival in milliseconds. Layer 1 was awake. Out at sea, Aegis-equipped destroyers adjusted course by degrees you could barely notice on a map, but would feel across history. Their P-1 radars lit the sky invisibly, tracking dozens of objects at once. Real warheads, possible decoys, fragments designed to confuse. This was the second layer, redundancy by design. Because in real war, perfection is a myth, but overlap is dominance. The missiles were still rising, still convinced they were alone. At 4:17 a.m., the first intercept window opened. Mid-course, vacuum, no sound, just physics colliding with intent. An SM-3 interceptor separated from its booster and went quiet, coasting on pure precision. No explosives, no fireball, just a kinetic kill vehicle closing distance at closing speeds that erase margin for error. What does a $12 million interceptor do to a missile built to terrify cities? It doesn't explode it. It erases it. Impact came high above the Pacific, invisible to anyone on the ground. One object became zero, a shockwave without sound. Data confirmed. Target neutralized. Probability collapsed to certainty. Then another. And another. Down on Guam, no one cheered. There was no time. Phones kept buzzing. Sirens continued. Because layered defense doesn't celebrate early. It assumes more is coming. And it was... The second wave of interceptors launched in sequence, each one handed a different problem to solve. Decoy discrimination, trajectory adjustment, time to impact shrinking with every heartbeat. The sky had become a three-dimensional chessboard moving at hypersonic speed, and every piece mattered. Across the Pacific, U.S. forces shifted posture. Submarines went quiet. Air wings began to move. Satellites narrowed focus. Not in panic, but in synchronization. Maximum alert isn't chaos, it's clarity. Everyone knows their lane. Everyone knows the cost of drifting out of it. Inside the Pentagon, the room stayed calm. Not because the threat was small, but because the data was undeniable. This wasn't a probe, not a test shot splashing harmlessly into the ocean. The vectors were clean, the timing coordinated, the intent unambiguous. This was a deliberate attack on U.S. territory. That realization was the turning point. Until then, response lived inside defensive brackets: protect, intercept, shield. But intent changes the equation. When an adversary reveals purpose, strategy stops being reactive and starts being final. Another intercept, then another. The layered shield held, but no one pretended that defense alone was victory. Defense buys time. Time buys options, and options decide outcomes. What North Korea had gambled on was hesitation. That America would pause, absorb, debate the political weather. That fear would slow motion. That distance would dilute resolve. Instead, distance had sharpened it. Because Guam wasn't just being defended, it was being watched as proof. Proof that systems worked. Proof that foresight beats firepower. Proof that strategy, when rehearsed in silence, moves faster than threats announced with flame. By 4:19 a.m., the picture was complete. Every incoming track accounted for. Every interceptor assigned. The shield wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be sufficient. And it was. Somewhere above the Pacific, another missile ceased to exist. No explosion, no headline, just absence. That absence carried weight. Because as the last intercept window closed, a different clock began counting. One not measured in minutes to impact, but in moments to response. The Pentagon no longer asked if this was escalation. The question now was how decisive the answer would be. Defense had done its job. Detection had spoken clearly. The message was received, decoded, and confirmed. And now, with the sky briefly clear and the island still standing, something else shifted quietly behind the scenes. Orders moving from contingency to execution, from if to now. The shield had held. But shields are never the end of the story. It was 4:21 a.m. in Washington when the room went silent. Not because there was doubt, but because the decision had already been made years ago. Inside the White House Situation Room, no one asked what this meant politically. No one asked how markets would react. The screens told a simpler story. A ballistic missile attack on U.S. territory. Trajectory confirmed. Intent undeniable. That single fact collapsed every debate into a straight line. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution of doctrine. The directive had a name, but it didn't need one spoken aloud. Everyone in the room knew it. If American soil is targeted by ballistic weapons, response is not measured. It is overwhelming. Not symbolic, not proportional, decisive enough to end repetition. At 4:21 and 30 seconds, authorization moved from conditional to absolute. No pause, no escalation ladder, full authority granted across the Indo-Pacific theater. The shift was subtle on the surface, just a change in status lights, but underneath it rewired the entire region. Indo-Pacific Command didn't wait for explanation. They had rehearsed this moment in silence for decades. The plan wasn't created this morning. It was refined through war games, simulations, and cold logic that assumed the worst, so the real moment would feel familiar. Target lists unfolded across secure displays. Missile launch sites first, fixed and mobile. Every known coordinate, every suspected hide. Then command bunkers, buried deep, hardened against fear, designed to survive noise but not inevitability. Nuclear infrastructure followed. Power nodes, control facilities, places that don't make headlines but decide futures. This wasn't about punishment. It was about removal. What North Korea believed was that escalation invited negotiation. That force opened the door. That firing first created leverage. But leverage only exists when both sides believe in return. This doctrine didn't. The red line had never been ambiguous, it was just rarely crossed. And now, without ceremony, North Korea had stepped over it. Not with a speech, not with a threat, but with ignition. In that moment, diplomacy didn't fail. It expired. Across the Pacific, orders propagated like a shockwave through steel and code. Units shifted from alert to execute. Pilots didn't ask why. Submarines didn't ask how long. Algorithms didn't ask permission. The system moved because it was built to move faster than fear. There was a strange calm in the room as confirmations came back. Authorization received. Target packages locked. Rules of engagement cleared. Allies notified, not asked, informed. The language had changed from contingency to certainty. What does overwhelming mean? It means the response is designed not to win the moment, but to erase the option of trying again. It means striking capability, not emotion. Infrastructure, not image. It means making sure the next decision never exists. Strategy over force. Mind over mass. Foresight over firepower. North Korea had calculated risk using visible weapons. Missiles on parades, rhetoric on screens. What it failed to calculate was preparation you never see. The silent architecture of response that doesn't need to improvise when the clock starts. At 4:23 a.m., the final confirmation arrived. Civilian leadership acknowledged, military command acknowledged, legal thresholds crossed, the chain was complete, there was no higher approval to seek. The point of no return wasn't loud. It was administrative. A signature, a code, a status change. And just like that, the question was no longer whether America would respond. It was how fast the consequences would arrive. Somewhere in North Korea, crews still believed this was pressure. That Guam was a message, that the world would absorb it, condemn it, and move cautiously. They were operating on an old model, one where reaction time was political. They hadn't realized reaction time had become mechanical. The irony was brutal. The very act meant to slow America had accelerated everything. By firing first, North Korea had removed every restraint it feared most. The lesson was quiet but permanent. Power doesn't reveal itself in threats, it reveals itself in thresholds. And once crossed, power doesn't argue. It executes. As the room in Washington returned to motion, another room, thousands of miles away, was just beginning to understand what had been unleashed. Screens lighting up, officers asking questions that no longer mattered, time compressing. Because decisions don't echo immediately. They travel. And somewhere beyond the horizon, forces already in motion were aligning. Not to defend, not to warn, but to end a problem that had just made itself unsolvable. The shield had spoken. The decision had been made. And now, the response was on its way. It was 4:27 a.m. when the Pacific Ocean broke its silence. Not with noise, but with motion so deliberate it felt premeditated, as if the night itself had been waiting for permission. From beneath the surface, far beyond the horizon, steel doors opened in the dark. American submarines didn't surface. They didn't announce. They simply released. One after another, cruise missiles ignited underwater, breached the sea like ghosts, and accelerated toward land at treetop height. No warning arcs, no dramatic climbs, just precision hugging terrain, invisible to anything still trying to see. At the same moment, halfway across the sky, stealth bombers began to move. Not scrambling, not rushing, but already en route. Their flight paths had been calculated long before the first missile ever left North Korea. They flew high, silent, and unreadable, carrying weapons designed not to frighten cities, but to end decisions underground. And then the lights went out. Across North Korea, radar screens filled with noise that wasn't static. It was deception. Electronic warfare systems surged across frequencies, bending signals, spoofing returns, collapsing situational awareness. Operators stared at displays that no longer meant anything. Friend looked like threat. Threat looked like air. The sky became a lie. This was the opening rupture. No single strike, no single direction. Everything at once. Cruise missiles split into waves, each carrying a different task. Some aimed for launch sites still warm from ignition. Others targeted fuel depots, command relays, hardened entrances disguised as hillsides. The algorithm didn't care about symbolism. It cared about sequence. Disable eyes first, then hands, then voice. What does dominance look like when it's quiet? It looks like targets going dark before they know they've been chosen. The first bunker collapsed without warning. Deep underground, reinforced concrete designed to withstand decades of threats failed in seconds. Not from brute force, but from precision, stacked on precision. Shockwaves traveled through rock like language. Walls folded, doors sealed permanently, communication stopped. Another facility vanished from the network, then another. Missile factories burned without spectacle. Not explosions for cameras, internal ruptures that ended production lines forever. Launch vehicles became scrap before keys could be turned. Control rooms went silent mid-sentence. Within minutes, the architecture of threat began to unravel. This wasn't a battle. It was subtraction. North Korea's military doctrine had been built around survivability. Hiding, dispersing, hardening. But survivability assumes time. And time had been removed from the equation. The turning point came not with the largest explosion, but with the realization spreading through what remained of command. Nothing was responding. Orders went out and came back empty. Backups failed, redundancies collapsed. The system had been optimized for intimidation, not resilience under simultaneous pressure. Strategy had outpaced force. Somewhere, deep underground, leadership bunkers designed to outlast nuclear exchange absorbed impacts that didn't announce themselves. Sequential strikes, calculated depths, each one erasing layers of confidence, then layers of concrete, then layers of certainty. The regime had planned for war to look loud. This war was surgical. Outside, observers would later describe it as overwhelming. But overwhelming doesn't mean excessive. It means decisive enough that recovery isn't a question. It means capability reduced so thoroughly that intent becomes irrelevant. Within a short span of time, shorter than the missile flight to Guam, the balance of the region shifted. Not symbolically, structurally. The question was no longer whether North Korea could threaten again. It was whether it could communicate at all. Across the world, signals were received clearly. Not speeches, not declarations, a demonstration. Attacking Guam wasn't treated as provocation. It was treated as a miscalculation with a terminal cost. Because Guam isn't an outpost. It's a line. And lines, when crossed, don't move backward. Philosophically, this was the paradox of power. The strongest response is rarely emotional. It's inevitable. Planned long before anger exists. Executed without spectacle. Designed not to punish, but to prevent. Foresight over firepower. Mind over mass. As the last wave completed its run and the electronic fog began to lift, what remained was silence of a different kind. Not the calm before danger, but the quiet after capability is gone. Somewhere, analysts began counting what was missing instead of what was left. Facilities offline, command nodes unreachable, missile counts frozen, leadership status unknown. The regime still existed on paper. But paper burns easily. And as dawn crept toward the peninsula, one question hung unanswered, heavier than smoke and more dangerous than fire. If this was the response to the opening move, what happens next?